Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're grabbing hold of some really interesting source material. We're tackling a question that just feels more and more pressing, especially as language models weave themselves into pretty much everything.
Absolutely. The question is, how much do these digital brains actually memorize from the huge amounts of data they're trained on?
Exactly. It's fundamental, right? It touches on privacy concerns, sure, but also just understanding how these things actually work, like under the hood.
Definitely. And we've got some really solid sources to help us unpack this. There's a study guide excerpt, which is helpful, but the main event is this pretty cutting-edge research paper.
Right, the one titled How Much Do Language Models Memorize? And it's got authors from, well, the big players, F at Meta, Google DeepMind, Cornell, NVIDIA. So this gives us a really strong academic perspective.
It does. It's not just surface level takes.
So our mission here is really to dig into this research, get the core concepts straight, and especially focus on the innovative parts, the new ideas and findings they're bringing to the table.
Yeah, to get beyond the sort of high-level discussion and give you a more precise, maybe more technical handle on what memorization even means in this context, and crucially, how these researchers are actually trying to measure it.
Okay, let's dive in then. The central question this work tackles seems simple, but it's actually pretty tricky. What does it really mean for an LLM to memorize something? And how on earth do you quantify that?
That's a good starting point, because before this specific research, how did people usually approach this? What were the standard ways of looking at model memorization?
Yeah, what was the kind of state of play before this paper?
Well, historically, the focus was often on things you could observe more directly, things like extraction or membership inference.
Okay, extraction and membership inference. Break those down quickly.
Sure, extraction is pretty straightforward. Can you prompt the model in a way that makes it spit out a specific piece of its training data verbatim, like a specific sentence or code snippet?
Got it. Just getting the data back out. And membership inference.
Membership inference, or MI, is a bit different. It's about figuring out if you can tell whether a specific data point, say a particular document, was actually in the massive training set the model learned from, just by looking at how the model behaves when it sees that data point. Maybe it processes it faster, or gives it a higher probability, or something changes internally.
Okay, so extraction is about output, MI is about recognition. And the sources we're looking at, they highlight some pretty significant limitations with just relying on those methods, right?
Absolutely. They point out that extraction, for instance, isn't a perfect measure of what the model really knows or remembers.
How so?
Well, think about a math problem, like, say, 2100. The model might give you the right answer, but did it memorize that specific result? Or did it learn the general process of exponentiation from seeing lots of examples of powers and multiplication?
Ah, right. It might have generalized the skill, not memorized the fact.
Exactly. If it learned the rules, it's generalization, not rote memorization of that specific calculation. And the paper also notes that extraction success can really depend on how you ask the model. The decoding strategy you use can completely change whether you get that specific data point out or not.
Okay, so extraction gets tanged up with learned skills versus pure memory, and it's sensitive to how you prompt. What about the issues with membership inference?
MI attacks are definitely useful, but they often give you a kind of a population level signal. They might tell you, okay, on average, across thousands of examples, we can distinguish training data from unseen data with this much accuracy.
But not for a single specific piece of data.
Often not reliably, no. They usually don't tell you definitively for this one specific data point and this specific trained model, whether that point was individually memorized in some deep sense. Plus, MI results can be affected by things like differential privacy or other techniques used during training.
Right. Okay, so that sets the stage. And this is where the source material introduces something, well, genuinely innovative, a new way of defining memorization coming from a more academic, rigorous angle.
Yes, exactly. This is really one of the core contributions here. They propose defining memorization using information theory, drawing on concepts like Kolmogorov complexity and its link to Shannon entropy.
Information theory. Okay, that sounds complex. What's the basic idea?
The core idea is actually quite elegant, I think. They say memorization is about how much better you can compress a specific piece of data, describe it more efficiently when you have the trained body available as a sort of reference guide compared to compressing it without the model.
Okay. So the model itself acts like a specialized compression tool for the data it remembers. If it's memorized something, it helps you encode that thing using fewer bits.
That's the intuition precisely. The information the model has stored specifically about that data point allows for a shorter description, a better compression. And this framework lets them make a really crucial distinction.
A distinction that maybe the older methods struggled with.
Yes, they rigorously separate two kinds of information the model might store about its training data. They call them unintended memorization and generalization.
Okay, unintended memorization versus generalization. What's the difference in their framework?
So, unintended memorization is information that's specific to the actual data set the model saw. It's about the unique details, the specific phrasing, maybe even errors or anomalies present only in that correction of data. This is the kind of memory that might, leak private information.
Got it. The stuff unique to the training set itself. And generalization.
Generalization is the information the model learns about the underlying process that generated the data. So the rules of grammar, common sense facts, statistical patterns that hold true more broadly, even for data the model hasn't seen before. This is the useful learning we actually want.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. So, using the earlier example, figuring out 2100 by applying learned math rules, that's generalization.
Right.
But if the model perfectly recalled some weird specific sentence, maybe with a typo that only appeared once in the training data just because it soaked that specific instance up, that would be unintended memorization.
That's exactly the kind of distinction they're aiming for. And the real advantage of defining it this way, using information theory, is that it's designed to work at the level of individual data points sample level. And importantly, it's defined independently of the specific algorithm used to train the model.
Which makes it more fundamental, more academic than just looking at whether you can extract something or not, or average MI scores.
Exactly. It digs deeper into what information is actually being stored.
Okay, this information theoretic definition based on compression is elegant. But you mentioned Kolmogorov complexity. Isn't that like famously uncomputable? How do they actually measure this stuff in their experiments?
Ah, yes, the practical hurdle. You're right. Pure Kolmogorov complexity is uncomputable. So they have to use approximations, practical computable proxies.
What kind of proxies?
The main technique relies on the model's likelihood function, basically how well the trained model predicts a given piece of data. If the model assigns a much higher probability to a specific data point compared to some baseline expectation, that suggests the model holds specific information about it. And they relate this higher likelihood back to the idea of better compression.
I see. Better prediction implies more stored information, which links back to compression. And based on this measurement idea, they introduce another key concept, model capacity.
Yes, model capacity. In their framework, that's defined as the total amount of unintended memorization, the dataset-specific information that a particular model architecture at a particular size can theoretically store.
How do they measure that total capacity?
They estimate the unintended memorization for each sample in a dataset using their likelihood method, and they basically sum it up across the whole dataset to get a measure of the total capacity used or the potential capacity of the model.
Okay, and this leads us to their really clever experimental setup for measuring this raw capacity. They didn't start with messy text data, did they? They used something simpler.
Right, this is where I think their experimental design really shines from an academic perspective. They trained models on synthetic data specifically, sequences of just uniformly random bits, zeros and ones with no pattern.
Random bits, why do that?
Because if the data is completely random, there's absolutely nothing to generalize. There are no underlying rules, no statistical correlations, no real-world knowledge embedded in it. It's pure noise.
Ah, so any information the model stores about this random data has to be.
Has to be unintended memorization of the specific random strings it happened to see during training. It can't be learning any general patterns because there are none.
So it isolates the model's raw ability to just store stuff. It measures its pure storage capacity for specific details without generalization getting in the way.
Precisely. It's a clean measure of how much specific sample level information the model architecture itself can retain.
That's really smart, like training on pure noise to see how much noise it can remember. So, what did they find? What's the capacity of these GPT-style transformer models based on these synthetic experiments?
They landed on a surprisingly concrete figure. Their estimate is that these models have an approximate capacity of 3.6 bits per parameter.
3.6 bits per parameter. Okay, that feels very specific. So for every single learnable number, every parameter in the model, you can think of it as being able to hold roughly 3.6 bits of this unintended data set specific information.
That's the interpretation within their framework, yes. They did see a bit of a range, maybe 3.5 to 4 bits per parameter, BPP, depending on the exact architecture or the numerical precision used. But the average estimates they reported were around 3.83 BPP for models using standard 32-bit floating point numbers, F32, and 3.51 BPP for models using the more compact 16-bit bfloat 16 format.
Wait, hang on. That difference is interesting. 3.83 for FP32, 3.51 for bfloat 16. So doubling the numerical precision from 16 bits to 32 bits only gave a tiny increase in this specific memorization capacity.
That was definitely a noteworthy finding they highlighted. It suggests that while using higher precision like FP32 might be important for other things, maybe stable training or representing complex generalized knowledge more accurately, a lot of those extra bits per parameter aren't primarily being used just to cram in more raw details about specific training examples.
Hmm. So precision and this specific storage capacity aren't quite the same thing.
It seems like they play somewhat different roles, yeah.
And did they find this capacity scaled predictably with model size? Like bigger models just have more room to store these specifics.
Yes, their experiments showed quite clearly that this capacity scales smoothly, essentially linearly with the number of parameters. You double the parameters, you roughly double the total potential capacity for unintended memorization.
Okay, so we have this rigorous new definition. We have a way to measure the raw storage capacity using random data around 3.6 BPP. Now let's bring it back to the real world. What happens when they train these models on actual text data, like the deduplicated fine web dataset they use? Now generalization is possible, right?
Exactly. With real text, you've got that mix. The model is trying to learn general language patterns, grammar, facts about the world, but it might also be memorizing specific phrases or sentences it saw.
So how do they tease those two apart, the generalization and the unintended memorization when looking at text?
To handle that, they introduced the idea of a reference model. This is typically a much larger, more capable model, maybe one trained on vastly more data, that serves as a stand-in for representing general knowledge, or the typical patterns you'd expect in that kind of text data.
Okay, like an oracle model that knows the general stuff?
Sort of. By comparing how much the model they trained compresses a specific piece of text versus how much this reference model compresses it, you can try to isolate the compression benefit that's unique to the trained model. That unique benefit is attributed to unintended memorization, while the compression achieved by both models is considered part of generalization.
Right, makes sense. Comparing against a baseline of general knowledge. So, what did they observe about unintended memorization when training on progressively larger text datasets?
They found something quite interesting. Initially, as the dataset size grew, the amount of unintended memorization stored by the model also went up. The model was, soaking up specific details from the text.
That seems logical. More data, more specifics to remember.
But then, as the dataset got even larger relative to the model's fixed size, the total amount of unintended memorization actually started to decrease.
Decrease, why would remembering specific things go down when you show it more data? That feels a bit counterintuitive at first.
Yeah, it does, but this is where the interplay between the model's limited capacity and the structure of the data becomes really key.
How so?
Well, think about it. When the dataset is relatively small compared to the model's 3.6 BPP capacity, the model can kind of afford to just store lots of specific details, lots of unintended memorization. But as the dataset grows larger and larger, the total amount of information in the data itself eventually exceeds the model's finite capacity to just remember everything sample by sample.
It runs out of room to store every specific detail.
Essentially, yes. At that point, the model is forced to find more efficient ways to represent the data to stay within its capacity limits. And what's the most efficient way to represent lots of related data points?
Find the common patterns, the underlying rules.
Exactly. It has to generalize. Identifying and storing the general patterns becomes a more compact way to represent the bulk of the information compared to remembering every single specific example. So generalization starts to essentially push out or replace some of the sample-specific unintended memorization because it's a better use of the model's limited capacity.
Wow. So the model is forced to learn because it can't just remember everything anymore. And this transition point, where the data set becomes too big for the model's raw memorization capacity, forcing it towards generalization, that sounds like it might connect to another phenomenon people see in deep learning.
It absolutely does. This is another really neat contribution of their work. Their framework provides a very clear information theoretic explanation for double descent.
Double descent, where model performance gets worse for a bit as it gets bigger and then starts improving again.
That's the one. They show quite convincingly that the point where performance starts to improve, again, the beginning of that second descent in the error curve, happens right around the point where the estimated information content of the data set starts to exceed the model's measured capacity.
So double descent kicks in when the model hits its memorization limit and has to start generalizing to cope with the data size.
That's the explanation their framework provides. The model is forced to switch strategies from rote memorization to learning general patterns, and that's when its performance on unseen data starts to improve again. It gives this somewhat mysterious empirical finding a really solid theoretical grounding.
That's a really significant connection. Okay, so let's bring this back to the practical concerns we started with things like privacy and security. How do these refined ideas about memorization and capacity relate to actually extracting training data or performing membership inference attacks?
Yeah, the research offers some really valuable insights there too. For extraction, when they looked at large text data sets, especially ones that had been deduplicated to remove exact reports, they found something maybe surprising.
What was that?
Most of the time, when they could successfully extract a sequence that also happened to be in the training set, it wasn't because the model had specifically stored that exact sequence from that one training example, what they call unintended memorization.
So it wasn't just regurgitating a specific memorized sample.
Not usually on large, diverse, deduplicated data. Instead, the extracted text was largely attributable to generalization. The model was simply generating a very likely, very common sequence of words based on the overall language patterns it had learned, and that sequence just happened to match something that was also in the training set.
So it looks like memorization, but it's actually just the model being good at predicting common phrases.
Pretty much. Now, they do note this is less true if the data set is very small or highly repetitive. In those cases, the model might indeed just memorize large chunks. But for the big, diverse data sets typical of LLMs, extraction seems often linked to generalization.
Okay, that's important for thinking about privacy risks. What about membership inference telling if a specific sample was in the training set?
Their findings there align with the capacity idea. They show that the effectiveness of membership inference attacks how well you can distinguish training data from non-training data. Often measured by something like F1 score generally goes down as the dataset size increases relative to the model's capacity.
So if the data set is enormous compared to the model's 3.6 BPP capacity, it gets harder to spot a training example just by how the model reacts to it.
Exactly. If the model simply doesn't have the capacity to store unique signatures for every single one of its billions or trillions of training samples, then distinguishing a specific training sample becomes much harder. There's less unique information stored per sample, on average.
And they even managed to formalize this relationship, put it into a kind of formula.
Yes, they did something quite impressive there. They developed a scaling law. It's a mathematical formula based on a sigmoidal function shape that predicts the expected membership F1 score based purely on the ratio between the model's total capacity in bits, calculated from parameters 3.6 BPP, and the estimated total information size of the training data set, also in bits.
Wow, a predictive formula for MI attack success. Did it work?
They showed it worked remarkably well. They validated it using larger GPT-2 models, Medium and XL, and found the formula accurately predicted the MI-F1 scores observed in practice. It helps explain quantitatively why MI attacks become progressively less effective on models trained on truly massive web-scale datasets. The dataset size just vastly outstrips the model's capacity to memorize specifics about every sample.
That's powerful. But they also noted something interesting, right? That MI could still be possible even if extraction wasn't.
Yes, that's a crucial nuance. They observed experiments where the membership F1 score could still be quite high, meaning you could reliably tell if something was training data like 0.97 in some cases, even when the rate of successfully extracting that exact data was essentially zero.
So the model might leave some subtle signal that it saw the data, even if it can't reproduce it verbatim. Recognizing is different from recalling.
Precisely. They're distinct failure modes, in a sense.
Now, maybe one of the most concrete and perhaps surprising findings in the paper is about what kind of data points tend to get unintentionally memorized the most, even when the model is trained on huge text data sets way past its capacity limit. What did they discover there?
Yeah, this is a really tangible result. They looked at which specific samples contributed most to the measured unintended memorization, even in models trained on the large fine web dataset. They found the model disproportionately memorized data points that contained rare tokens.
Rare tokens, like unusual words.
Often, yes, sequences that were statistically unusual in the dataset. Specifically, they found these highly memorized points often involve sequences from non-English languages, things like snippets of Japanese, Chinese, or Hebrew text that were present but uncommon in the largely English dataset they used. These rare sequences also correlated strongly with high TF-IDF scores, which is a measure of how unique a word or phrase is within a document collection.
So the model tends to hang on to the weird bits, the outliers, the fragments of other languages embedded in the main text.
That seems to be the case. Because these sequences are rare, they stand out statistically. Maybe the model can't easily represent them through general patterns learned from the dominant language. English in this case. So it ends up dedicating some of its specific memorization capacity, 3.6 BPP, to storing these unique outliers.
It gives us a concrete picture of what that unintended memorization might actually look like in practice. It's not necessarily random facts, but often these statistically rare elements.
Exactly. It's not just abstract bits. It manifests as preferential storage of these less common sequences.
Wow, that is fascinating and maybe a little unsettling too. Okay, let's try and pull this all together. What are the main takeaways you think listeners should really grasp from this deep dive into the research?
Okay, I think there are a few key things. First, and maybe most importantly, this work gives us a much more rigorous, academically grounded way to even talk about memorization in LLMs. That split between unintended memorization and generalization, rooted in information theory, is really powerful.
Right, it's a more precise lens than just extraction or basic MI tests.
Second, they gave us a method using that clever synthetic data trick to actually put a number on the raw storage capacity of these models that figure of around 3.6 bits per parameter for GPT-style architectures. It gives us a concrete sense of scale.
And we saw this framework isn't just theory, it connects to real-world observations.
Absolutely. It provides a compelling explanation for things like double descent, linking it directly to model capacity versus dataset size. And it yielded that scaling law that helps predict how hard membership inference will be based on that same ratio.
And finally, that specific finding about what gets memorized.
Yeah, that really concrete, maybe surprising finding that even when trained on huge, diverse text data sets, models seem to disproportionately use their unintended memorization capacity to store the rare outlier data points, often things like non-English text snippets in their experiments.
So overall, this research provides better tools, both conceptually and practically, for understanding what these models are really knowing through generalization versus just remembering specific training examples, and it helps quantify potential risks like membership inference.
Exactly. It pushes the academic understanding forward significantly.
Which leads us nicely into a final thought, something provocative for you, the listener, to consider. Given this finding that LLMs seem to preferentially hang on to the rare, the uncommon, the outlier data points, what does that imply for how we should approach curating the massive data sets used to train them?
Hmm. And maybe even more pointedly, what are the privacy implications if the most unique or unusual aspects of someone's data, the very things that make it distinct, are precisely what these models are most likely to unintentionally memorize, even if buried within an ocean of more general information?
Definitely something to think about the next time you interact with one of these incredibly powerful and increasingly common language models.